Hey Nikki, thanks for joining this first Grand Prix Tour update video. Before we talk about that though, I wanted to give you a chance to just catch us up a bit on your background. Tell us a bit
Sure.
about LastTenth. When did you start coaching and like what's different about the LastTenth approach?
Cool. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Certainly really cool to chat with you again. It's been a while. Last 10th, it started as a YouTube channel, many of which people would probably have seen it. And it really started because I saw a lot of videos out there that were in two camps, like often one that is very kind of scientifically accurate, but not as entertaining as you might like it to be, and another camp where it's entertaining, there's authoritative figures, people of respect, but it's not entirely scientifically accurate. So I kind of looked at it and thought, why can't it be from a very scientific background? Everything is factual, scientifically accurate, but it's maybe a 5-10 minute video with images to help people absorb it, and entertaining, something you can kind of just sit for 5 minutes even on the can and kind of watch it. And that's kind of how it started. The coaching's different in the sense that a lot of it's very data oriented, but it's not what you think. So if you look at a lot of data oriented coaching out there, it's a lot of comparative, right? It's you have a faster driver with a lap, and you kind of look at it. So, oh, he turns in here, he brakes here, he does this different, and that's why he's faster. And I don't do any of that in my coaching. I don't use reference data. I just use the student's data, and I look at where the mistakes are. So where he's using too much steering, where he's braking too hard or not braking hard enough, where his throttle application is too fast or maybe even too slow. And everything is compared to what I think, in my opinion, is scientifically optimal, like physically optimal, right? And the whole premise of that is when you try to copy or mimic a faster driver, you assume that they don't make no mistakes, and when they do make mistakes, you copy that too. So I thought, why not just skip the middleman and just go straight to optimal?
So you've been involved a little bit with the Grand Prix Tour League that we started basically the beginning of this year,
Yeah,
and you've certainly seen how it's doing something similar to what you've done with LastTenth, right? Where we're taking the
yeah,
traditional league experience in iRacing and tweaking it just enough to make it something different. So we just
yeah.
completed our second major championship race, which is this unique feature of the league where we set up certain races to be deliberately more challenging than
Yeah,
regular
that's right.
races. So we're
hmm
trying to throw, tough conditions, technical tracks at the drivers. It's a very highly skilled driver group. And then we reward more points for the performance in those events. So, how do you approach strategy going into a race? I know you mentioned it a little bit, and then like, what about setup?
hmm So, well, first of all, I want to say that it's really cool that GPT's kind of taking this approach, because I find a lot of times, um, th- in a lot of leagues there are challenges, but I find there can be more dimensions of challenge,
Yep.
right? So very a lot of leagues you get challenge, you get challenges as in you get really 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 quick drivers, and you
Yes.
just have to compete with them on pace. But very few leagues, and I know there are some, but very few leagues, at least the ones I participate in, will maybe force you to run two pit stops, but if you're savvy, you can run one,
Yep.
right? And how does that work? Or like you said, what if you put a strong headwind on this long straight and have to get the drivers to figure out how to work their arrow a bit better, right? A bit more efficient with their arrow. So I think it's really cool that you're taking this approach to kind of have in each round have like very specific challenges. It's almost like a game within a game
Yep.
to sort of elevate the driving, right? So, but to answer your question, in terms of strategy, I first start with setup, right? So I'll start, if I don't know the track, I'll learn the track, and I start with setup. And usually, I start with aero. Like, do I want a mid, high, or low kind of downforce? And with the, I just drive a few laps, and with the data I collect, I'm usually have a pretty good idea of where I kind of want to be, right?
Hmm.
And from there, I'll just kind of tweak the setup, and it's always a challenge because you have to decide, when to stop, because a setup is never done,
Yep.
right? Just like Just like improving your driving is never done, or learning a track or preparing for a race, it's never done. At some point, I just say, okay, I got to move on to something else. And so after I do the setup, I'll look at strategy, and usually it comes down to uh, nowadays with a lot of leagues, there's a pit stop, and what I try to explore is, do I really need to take that pit stop, right? And if I don't, am I actually gaining an advantage? So you knowing that, knowing you've kind of helped us, helped me and Chris Braun, who, some people may know that, we've been betaing our app called EZrace, which is basically a strategy application, right? So for example, some users have used it and been able to kind of cut 20 seconds off their entire race by being able to skip a pit stop, right? So that's kind of what I would explore. I would look at, well, if I cut a pit stop and I feel safe, am I able to save time, and how much time? And then also strategically, depending on where I start, do I want to save fuel, right? So maybe if I'm at the front, I might actually want to save fuel because I will hold all the cars behind me back. Meanwhile, they're not saving fuel. So by the time they realize, it's too late for them to switch strategies.
So the Grand Prix Tour, is sort of a second dimension of it. In addition to having these, world-class drivers, we strive to have the best drivers basically in iRacing. The
Hmm.
average I rating of the drivers in the Grand Prix Tour right now is over 3,300,
Hmm.
and yet we don't stop there because we know I rating is sort of an imperfect measure to say the least.
Yeah.
So we focus on clean driving, and you've been
Yep.
generous enough to support the league and join us as sort of our independent third-party incident
Hmm.
review team member. So you're on the committee that reviews any incidents that the drivers want to submit for review.
Hmm.
What is it that you think makes the difference between those drivers who can only be fast and really just aren't that safe? What how do you balance being fast and safe?
I think in terms of uh, the balance of sort of aggression and safety is that, sure, in the race there are uh, it's something to consider, and there are a lot of instances where you need to kind of change it. So it's not like the entire race, this is the balance I work with. So you might start with a default of, certain things you don't do, certain things you do, certain gaps you go for, certain gaps you don't. But like many people know, at the end of the race, if you're fighting for position, you might be a bit more aggressive. Or the final race of the season, you're racing your rival, hey, you might leave him a little bit less room than you normally do with other drivers, right? And I think that's pretty common. But I think what also some people don't realize is that even from lap to lap, um, you can actually tweak that balance from corner to corner. When you have certain corners, which are kind of have maybe a bit more tricky or a bit more high risk because there are walls around, or it's very easy to hit dirt or something like that, you may want to scale it down a little bit, or maybe not race people as hard in those corners. So I think a lot of times people realize there's a balance with how you conduct the entire race, how you conduct the beginning versus the end, or who you're racing against, whether they're safe or aggressive or unsafe. But also from corner to corner within a lap, there are various places where you can take a bit more risk, in certain areas where you probably shouldn't.
Uh, I think you make a great point. I mean, it's so one of the things we mentioned in the league charter is basically that there's a minimum 2,000 I rating requirement to be into the
Hmm.
league, but that's not based on any significance of the 2,000 mark itself, other than in order to achieve 2,000 I rating, you have to do a decent amount of racing. Like you're not
Yep.
gonna like join the sim and do 3 races and be 2,000. I think what you're
Yep.
describing is experience. I
Hmm.
certainly haven't figured out how to drive safely without just making a bunch of mistakes, along the
Yep.
way. And you start to learn when you can push something, when you can't, when the tires are giving up, when you've got grip, who that person next to you is, and can I trust them? That's a
Yep.
big factor. Obviously, the dynamics change when everyone in the session is a good safe driver. You can
Yep.
actually then race much more closely and more aggressively, like you're saying, because you trust the guy next to you knows how to manage a 3-inch gap, and I don't need to give him a
Hmm.
whole car and a half. You know what I mean? So I think
Yeah.
it's a
and
really great point.
and I think your comment about experience is kind of totally nail on the head. um I find, like, just going back to your question about balancing aggression with risk, So I came from a financial background where I do investment research, and so like risk reward is kind of like my everyday thing, right? So
Hmm.
when you kind of look at that, it's not a static thing, right? So as a driver learns, improves, makes mistakes, interacts with different drivers, newer drivers, better drivers, worse drivers, faster, slower drivers, their perception of that balance kind of evolves over time, and it settles. It kind of um, converges to a certain point that is suitable for them, and that kind of becomes their driving style, right? It's basically their habits.
Yep.
So I think it's not something that uh, it's not something that people get right immediately, and it's not something that people should get right immediately. I think it's always something that they will progressively get better and better at it, and then they'll notice something happened, like they got an incident, and the important part is studying these incidents, right? You get an incident, you always review what happened, always look at it from multiple angles, always take your own kind of personality out of it and see, well, like people always say, what can I do to avoid this? Should I have done this? Was this worth what I tried to do?
Yeah.
Right. And it's an evolution. People progressively kind of learn.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Nikki. Appreciate the time tonight, and looking forward to the rest of our season together. And thank you for your contributions to the league.
Right, no problem. Glad to be participating, and thanks for sitting in with me and having chat.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks, Nikki.